I hear from a lot of frustrated would-be gardeners at the farmers market stand who say they just don't have enough sun in their yard to be able to grow anything. Of course, they can always go to maximum effort by growing in smaller containers and just moving them around the yard as the season progresses to catch the light as the sun shifts, but that's a lot of work. But it's also very possible that many of these potential gardeners have more sun than they think. And this goes for my gardeners who are apartment dwellers or who live in condos with only a patio or balcony space to grow on. You might be able to grow more than you think. And there actually are a selection of vegetables, fruits, and herbs that will do just fine in part sun, and others that will tolerate it if you have a little patience with them. Today on Just Grow Something, we're going to define full sun, part shade, and shade, so you have a better idea of what is actually possible in some areas of your yard. And then we'll go over the choices available if you truly do have less than full sun. Plus, we'll go over your answers to the April question of the month and explore how we can solve some of the most common garden maintenance struggles you and I both have. Let's dig in. Hey, I'm Karen. I started gardening in a small corner of my suburban backyard, and now 18 years later, I've got a degree in horticulture and operate a 40-acre market farm. I believe there is power in food and that everyone should know how to grow at least a little bit of their own. On this podcast, I share evidence-based techniques to help you plant, grow, harvest, and store all your family's favorites. Consider me your friend in the garden. So, grab your garden journal and a cup of coffee and get ready to just grow something. Let's jump into the answers to the April question of the month. What have you struggled with the most in terms of garden maintenance, and did you find a solution? I think all but one of these answers came from the Facebook group, and we will start with the answer from Kelly Monahan. She says, plant nutrients are by far my biggest struggle. I'm hoping to find a way this year to help me remember what I need to do and when I need to do it. Thank you for sharing, Kelly. That is a big one for a lot of gardeners. If I have a specific nutrient that needs to be fed at a specific interval, so for example, a nitrogen amendment for my onions, where I'm supposed to feed them every 3 weeks until they start to bulb, well, then I put it on the calendar when I plant that crop. That way, it makes it onto my task list for the week, regardless of what other craziness is going on in the gardens. But part of this, too, is knowing what to feed which plants. So in general terms, when we're trying to encourage leafy growth, we want the plants to have access to adequate nitrogen. When we're encouraging flowering and fruiting, we focus less on nitrogen and more on phosphorus and potassium. So some of the flowering and fruiting plants that we want to have nice foliage to protect the fruit, like the tomatoes and the peppers, are going to rely on nitrogen early on and then draw more on the phosphorus and the potassium later on in their growing cycle. So your best bet is to take a soil test in the spring to understand what is actually in the soil and what is lacking, and then go from there. If the plants are going to need a boost of all three nutrients, then a balanced fertilizer with equal amounts of all three nutrients at the beginning of the season might be the best bet. And then supplementing later with specific amendments targeting the plant's stage of growth might be needed if you start to see some deficiencies. For those really heavy feeders of specific nutrients like nitrogen for garlic and onions early on, then marking that feeding schedule on your calendar at the time of planting is actually going to be more effective. Next up, Cody Ruth said, trellises. Why oh why doesn't my husband hop to it when I tell him to put more up? LOL. We used the biggest tomato cages we could find last year, and after an evening of 60 to 100 mile per hour straight line winds, and then in parentheses, she says, sing it with me, Oklahoma, where the wind comes sweeping down the plains. Thanks, Cody. She says, we used 6-foot tall 1x2s to hold each of those mangled cages upright for the rest of the season. This year, I purchased some old security screens for trellises, but we have yet to get them installed where I need them, and my tomatoes are currently hardening off. So being prepared ahead of time is absolutely key when it comes to trellising. And a lot of the time it really is trial and error. We totally underestimated the necessity for solid trellises twice with our loofah plants. We're growing round 3 of the loofah this year, and we still have yet to get the appropriate trellises secured and in place for the season. Trellises can be tricky, especially if you face those types of winds on a regular basis. That's what pulled our trellises for the loofah down the first year, and we didn't even get them back up again. The plants just had to continue growing on the ground because they were just too darn heavy to heave back up into place. So for things like sweet potatoes and pole beans that need trellises but maybe aren't as heavy as the fruiting plants, almost anything is going to serve as a trellis. So long as it's secured into the ground and then maybe secured to each other, then it's usually fine. But when we get to things like tomatoes or cucumbers or winter squashes that bear heavy fruit and that continue to grow and produce all season long, my favorite trellis is hands down cattle panel or hog panel. So if you've not seen what these look like, they are 5-foot tall by 16-foot long panels, and they're made of galvanized wire welded together in sort of a woven pattern where the wires are spaced about 4 to 6 inches apart. They're very sturdy because, they're used to contain cattle. Hog panels are designed in the same way, but they're shorter. They're usually only about 3 to 4 foot tall. You can use these in a couple of different ways. You can use T-posts driven into the ground to hold the panels up just like a section of fence as intended, and then just plant your tomatoes or cucumbers or squash or whatever in front of them and then just tie them to the panels as they grow. Eventually the plant's going to go up and over the panel and it's going to come down the other side. The alternative to this is to create a sort of a tunnel out of the panel by securing the short side to the ground with the T-posts and then bending the panel over so the long side creates a half moon shape or a tunnel shape, and then securing the other short side of the panel to the ground. I hope I'm explaining that correctly. Do an internet search, you'll see what I mean. Both methods are very sturdy once they are secure. Now, of course, these panels aren't necessarily cheap, but they are a one-time investment that is going to last for decades. Right now, I think one panel in our area runs about $28 US. So if that's too rich for your budget or you're just starting out, just using the T-posts as a stake and then tying the plant to it also works. Tomato cages work well for smaller plants. Maybe not actually for tomatoes unless they are like a determinate tomato that doesn't put on a ton of foliage all season long. I have seen people create their own cages out of concrete mesh or reinforcement mesh, which is definitely sturdier than your regular tomato cage. You can get creative, but one of the keys to all of this is no matter what you're using to trellis your plants with, you need to be ready early. It is very difficult to add cages later on once your plants get growing. And if you're using stakes and trellising with string using one of those methods, if you don't start early and keep up with it, you can actually damage the plants when you're stringing them up. So whatever your trellising method is, decide on it early. Get your supplies gathered before you are ready to plant so that your plants don't suffer later on and you don't get frustrated with it. Thank you for sharing your frustration, Cody, and no more trying to get me to sing on air, okay? Rich Flint said, I was struggling with keeping a good gardening journal. I tried a notebook with tabs for fruit trees, the food forest, as well as the traditional vegetable garden, but never actually logged anything in it. Then I tried an electronic journal on my phone. Still failed to keep up with it. Then I tried the iPhone journal. Nothing. Lastly, I bought an 18-month business planner. It has a space to list everything I planned at the beginning of each month, as well as space to log important details on a daily basis. I keep it beside my chair and write in it almost daily with such things as rain, watering, fertilizing, when I planted, and when said planting should be ready to harvest, etc. I'm not sure why this worked where the others didn't. I'm just pleased I found a system that works for me. Today, I was happy to write that I harvested the first of my green beans, 4 pounds, 4 ounces. Okay, this makes my garden planning heart really happy to hear. I also struggled with how to keep track of what I needed to track, and I also found that electronic means just weren't the way to go for me. It's not to say that I don't use my phone for notes while I'm outside. I do. I just use my notes app to annotate really quickly what it is that I'm observing, or if I made a change of where something was planted versus where I'd originally mapped out for it to be planted. But a paper version is where everything lives permanently, and that is what I finally landed on. Now, my garden journal is also my garden planner. I've kind of rolled it all into one, and I'm going to age myself here. Does anybody remember Trapper Keepers? I don't know, I think I was in junior high maybe when these things were really popular. They're these big zippered binders that had all of these folders and all kinds of little cubbies in them. And it was just the perfect place to literally keep all of your school papers. I went looking specifically for a Trapper Keeper when I finally sort of came up with how I wanted to keep my garden journal and my garden plan. I didn't find that particular brand, but I did find something from, I'm looking at it now to see who makes it. 5 Star is the brand, and it is a zippered binder that has a spot for where I keep my graph paper, which is what I use to create my garden maps. It's got a spot for a calendar. It has all my notations for what seeds I am running out of. My seed inventory is in there. All of my planting dates and everything is in there. Information about maybe things that I want to plant for next year. It's also got sheets in there for me to annotate things about the weather or bugs or whatever else it is that I'm seeing. It zips closed so I can take it out into the garden with me if I want to. Most of the time, it just resides in my office right there next to my desk, and I will, take my notes on my phone while I'm outside and then come inside and sort of transfer it over into that permanent home. That has worked really, really well for me with the exception of the calendar. My calendar actually is larger than that. I use one of those desktop blotter ones, so I have plenty of room to write things. So it just sits right there on my desk for constant reference. So kudos, Rich, for not giving up until you found something that works for you. And hopefully this inspires everybody else to sort of keep looking if you haven't found a way that does work for you. One method doesn't necessarily have to be the end all be all. You don't have to, I'm only using my iPhone, notes thing or whatever, or I'm only using this online planner. Play around with different options and see if a combination of options might work for you. Next up, we have Brittany McCormick. She said, weeding, fertilizing, and praying that I can keep up with my first garden journal this year. Using straw and leaves this year to cut down weeding, fingers crossed. Fertilizing. I'm still figuring that out, but with the notes I've taken during your specific vegetable podcast and putting it on a spreadsheet, I'm hoping it will just click. Thanks for all that you've taught us listeners. Okay, yes, spreadsheets. That makes my heart happy. Okay. This is a great idea for keeping track of the specific needs of the plant that you're growing, especially if it needs a certain type of nutrient early on and then a change in the nutrients later. So sort of like the garlic and the onions we talked about. Now keep in mind though, that most of our garden plants will do just fine with something that is balanced with an equal availability of all 3 major nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Unless there is a real overabundance of a nutrient and the plant starts taking up way more than it needs, a balanced amendment is just fine. Again, if you do a soil test and you know what's available first, this is also going to make it easier to know what to feed and when. If your soil is well amended with compost or aged manure or worm castings or other natural amendments that increase the soil organic matter at the same time it's providing nutrients, you may not need to fertilize at all during the growing season if it's not something with specific feeding needs. And a big thumbs up for using straw and leaves as a mulch to keep down the weeds. So not only are you helping choke out the weeds, but that organic type of mulch will also slowly break down where it's in contact with the soil and add organic matter and nutrients. So I love these solutions, Brittany. Thank you for sharing. Tammy Ingalls said, sticking to a fertilizer or water schedule, or staying on top of treating for pest pressure, and always struggling to stay on top of weeding. Keeping up with my garden journal. I do great in February, March, and April, but through the summer, I am just surviving. Yes, I feel like this goes along with Rich and his struggle to find a proper journaling technique. My garden journal and my garden plan, like I said, are all rolled into one zippered binder that includes the calendar with any fertilizing requirements. So when I sit down at my desk on Sunday afternoon to plan out my week in my daily planner, I look at that garden calendar, and any tasks that are on that calendar for the week, those get put into my agenda during the week. That includes seed starting, transplanting, fertilizing, spraying the tomatoes with copper spray to keep the diseases away, maybe spraying beneficial nematodes near my fruit trees to take care of the grubs. Whatever it is was put on my calendar way back in January when I make my plan. That's when I have the time to sort of think about things. So that way, when it comes to now, it's already there as a task at this time of the season when I just don't have time to think about it. This is one of the techniques that I actually teach about in detail in my Plan Like a Pro online course, because it took me years to figure out how all of this could work together and work together well. So if you have ever wondered how we plant up to 4 acres of veggies and keep track of the interplantings and the succession crops and the feeding and the weeding and the trellising and still manage to get things harvested on time and cleaned and packed and prepped for market, plus going to market, plus making deliveries, and it's just the two of us, yeah, this is how. It's managing my garden plan and my garden journal and my garden calendar all together in one place and making it into a system. Now, when we talk about a watering schedule, Tammy, your frustration is not unusual. Jennifer Caputo said via email, I've struggled the most with irrigation. In the summer, I can spend 30 to 45 minutes a day before work hand watering everything. I know I need to get an irrigation system, but I've been overwhelmed with the options and making sure I pick the right one. Drip line, drip take, soaker hose, etc. But I've spent the last several weeks watching dozens of YouTube videos and reading every article I can, and I think I'm almost ready to tackle it. My husband says I don't have time for another project, but I say that I don't have time not to do this one. Jennifer, I am siding with you on this one. Figuring out your irrigation is definitely something that will save you time in the long run. Tammy is struggling with a schedule. I think you are struggling with technique. And I think these are both things that a lot of gardeners have trouble with. Here's my take on this. First of all, whichever techniques work best for you is the one that is best. Whether it's a drip line, a soaker hose, hand watering, whatever it is, so long as we're adhering to a couple of different things. Number one is trying to water at ground level. We talked about this last week when talking about foliar diseases, so we know it's important for that reason. But we also are going to experience much more efficient watering if it's closer to the soil. We're losing less to evaporation, and we're losing less to the water being blown around by the wind. So it's getting to its intended target faster and at a higher volume. But the other thing to remember is that we want less frequent, more thorough waterings. Now, I understand the need for an automated system for some people because of their schedule, but I caution against just setting a schedule at the beginning of the season, randomly choosing an amount of time that you're going to run the system, and then never looking back again until the fall. The best way to determine just how much water you need or how long you need to run your system for or turn your sprinklers on or how long you have to stand there with the hose is by doing a test early in the spring. So check to see how dry your soil is. If it is dry at the 3 to 4 inch depth, then go ahead and water. So wait in the spring until it dries out to about that 3 to 4 inch depth. Then turn your soaker hoses on or your drip line or your sprinkler or stand there with your hose, whatever it is that you're using, and let it run. And then check the soil every 15 minutes. Do not stop watering in whatever manner you're doing it until the soil is soaked to the 6th inch depth. Okay? Why do we want to do it this way? Most of our plant roots are going to be at about the 4 to 6 inch deep mark when they are at their height of growth. And we want those roots to be trained to reach down deep into the soil versus staying up at the upper level of the soil. Because that upper few inches of the soil, that top 1 to 2 inches, dries out very, very quickly. But the deeper you go into the soil, the less moisture loss there is, even in the heat of the summer. So if we can train those roots early on to go down deeper into the soil to seek out the water, the better off we're going to be. Because if we can water to that 6-inch depth, we're going to have to water less frequently. So even though the top 2 inches are going to be dried out, the 3 to 4 inch mark isn't going to be nearly as dry, and that 6-inch depth is going to stay pretty well soaked. So if we're not watering again until the soil is dry at that 3 to 4 inch mark, we're going to have to water less frequently, okay? So once you have figured out how long it takes you to soak that soil to the 6-inch depth, then check that soil again, pretty much daily at first, to see how long it takes for it to be dry at that 3 to 4 inch depth, okay? And however long that takes, that is your watering schedule. So let me see if I can make this make sense. If I water on Monday, right, and it takes me 30 minutes to get my garden beds soaked down to the 6-inch depth, then that's what I'm going to do, right? And then every day I'm going to check to see how quickly it dries out to the 3 to 4 inch depth. So if it is Thursday before it is dry at the, say, 3.5 inch mark, then I know that my watering schedule for this time of the year is to water about every 3 days. I'm going to water on Monday, and I'm not going to water again until Thursday, which means if I water on Thursday, I'm not going to water again until Tuesday. That is your watering schedule. Now, does it have to be that exact? No. If you're trying to set up something that is automated and you say, okay, I'm just going to water Mondays and Thursdays, and you maybe let it run an extra 10 minutes to get you, to fill that gap, then that's fine. But what that does mean is that you're not running the sprinkler or the watering system every single day for 15 minutes. You're running it every 3 to 4 days for 30 minutes, and your plants are going to be better off for it. The key to this, though, is to check this again as the season gets hotter, because obviously things are going to dry out a little bit faster as it starts to heat up. So your watering intervals may need to be a little bit closer together at that point. And then as you get later on in the season, things start to cool off again. You may not have to water as frequently. But I tell you, most gardeners that I talk to are watering way too frequently, and they are not watering deeply enough into their soil. And that is part of the reason why our plants are suffering. And now I know, because you know me, that this goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. One of the things that is going to help keep you from having to water as frequently is also mulch. A very, very good layer of mulch. If you've never used mulch before and you hear me yammer on about this every single time, please, please trust me in knowing that it really does make that much of a difference. A 2 to 3 inch layer of mulch is invaluable for trapping the soil moisture where it needs to stay. And you will have to water less frequently. So do yourself a favor. Once you figure out what your watering schedule is, make sure that you have a really good layer of mulch on there so that you don't have to water as often. Your plants will thank you for it. I may be a vegetable gardener, but I'm all about adding some color to the garden, and it's never too early to dream about spring roses. With Heirloom Roses, you can build your wish list all year long, order anytime, and choose the perfect delivery date for your gardening zone. With roses for zones 3 through 11, there is literally a rose for every garden. You can reserve your new favorite roses at heirloomroses.com and enjoy risk-free planting with their 1-year guarantee, which I super appreciate because I don't have the best best track record with roses. I am currently obsessed with their Julio Iglesias rose with its stunningly striped petals and strong citrus and verbena fragrance. I'm adding this one to my garden this year for cut flowers. Heirloom Roses knows that the best roses start with the best roots, which is why they only hand propagate own root roses, not grafted, investing in the foundations of your garden so you can reap the rewards of tons of healthy blooms this spring. Heirloom Roses has offered all of my listeners 20% off your next order with code JUSTGROW now through October 31st, 2024. Select from a collection of roses suited for your growing zone and shipped at the proper time, and use code JUSTGROW for 20% off at heirloomroses.com. Okay, now, so I have a fun little announcement. The first episode of June, when we would normally be revealing the answers to the May question of the month, will be the 200th full episode of this podcast. Now, I'm not counting replays and bonus type episodes, just full, unique episodes, and we are coming up on number 200. So I thought it would be fun for May's question of the month to be an AMA, Ask Me Anything. And this doesn't have to be gardening related. It absolutely can be. But if you're curious about something else I've talked about, then go for it. Ask away. I have had people DM me asking about my running or weight training or my time in the military or just about podcasting in general. And I've always answered those questions just directly to whomever asked it. And I thought maybe it would be fun to answer them here instead on the 200th episode. So go ahead. Ask me anything. Reply in Spotify, reply to the weekly email, post it in the Facebook group, or DM me on social. You have until May 31st to ask your question. All right, on to the sun shade issue in our gardens. Let's start by defining what each classification of sun or shade means when we look at those plant tags or those seed descriptions. It very well may be that you have closer to full sun than you think. Full sun is defined by a minimum of 6 hours of sunlight. Most references say 6 to 8 because it is possible to have too much sunlight for some crops. I have a 1-acre planting area that gets a full day of sun regardless of the time of year. If the day length is 10 hours, it gets 10 hours. If we have 18 daylight hours, that field gets almost the full 18 hours. I have to choose which plants I put in that field very carefully because they can be subject to sun scald. Ideally, most vegetables thrive with 6 to 8 hours. Part sun is defined as 3 or 4 hours, up to 6 hours of sunlight. As we'll discuss, there are lots of plants that do well with this limited amount of daylight, and there are others who can tolerate it with some special care. Part shade is considered dappled sunlight. Think about plants that are in the drip line of a large tree that only get the light that gets filtered through the foliage. This is part shade. Be aware, though, that many plant growers will use this term interchangeably with part sun, so pay attention to the plant description to determine if it truly does well in part shade. Many houseplants will fall into this category because they do well in low light settings. And finally, we have shade. This is a complete lack of direct sunlight, even though the plant will get ambient light from its surroundings. There are plenty of annual flowers that do well in these conditions, like begonias and impatiens, but no vegetable or fruit plants that we would see in a typical home garden that I'm aware of. Understand also that whichever amount of sunlight you get, it's cumulative. So that means if a spot in your yard gets 4 hours of morning sun and then it gets shaded by a big tree all day, but then it gets 2 hours of evening light right before the sun goes down, you have full sun. That's 6 hours. It doesn't have to be all at once. Once I explain the definitions of full sun and the fact that it doesn't have to be all in a row, many folks suddenly realize that they can grow the majority of the garden fruits and veggies in some spot in their yard. But for those that truly only have part sun, you are not at a loss. Let's talk which veggies, fruits, and herbs that all do well in about 3 to 6 hours of light per day. The first one is leafy greens. Leafy greens like lettuce, spinach, kale, Swiss chard, and arugula can all tolerate part sun and still produce really decent yields. They are generally more shade tolerant than other vegetables, and so they can thrive with less sunlight. Number two is herbs. Many herbs can grow in part sun conditions. Mint, parsley, cilantro, and chives are specifically tolerant of lower light levels, and they can still provide a really good harvest. Stevia is another one that is good for part sun. Now, some of these might get a little bit leggy, meaning there's going to be a little bit more distance between the leaf nodules on the stem, but they will still produce plenty to harvest in lower light conditions. Number three is root vegetables. There are some root vegetables that can tolerate part sun, although they just might not get their maximum size or yield. So things like radishes, beets, salad turnips, and carrots can all still produce satisfactory results with those 3 to 4 hours of sunlight. The closer we get to 6 hours, the better, but they will still survive. And then finally, there are some fruits that will do okay. Now, most fruiting plants do require full sunlight to produce like an abundant amount of fruit, but there are a few options that can tolerate more shade. Strawberries will still produce a decent harvest. I mean, they may not be as prolific as those that are grown in full sun, but they will tolerate partial sun and still produce. Raspberries, the same way. They are likely to produce fewer fruits compared to those that are grown in the full sun, but they will tolerate partial sun. And then currants also fall into this category. And then finally, bok choy loves partial shade, actually really likes to have that afternoon shade, so very suitable for areas with limited sunlight. And all the other Asian greens, really, tatsoi, mitsuna, komatsuno, those can also thrive in partial shade conditions and still provide a really good harvest. Now, there are a few options that don't necessarily thrive in partial sun, but they can survive. And if you have some patience, they will produce a yield. So these plants may end up being a little leggy. The fruit may take longer to get to maturity, and they may not be as big as if they were in full sun. But if you really are desperate, you can still get a yield from them. You just have to have a little patience and allow them to take their time to do what they're going to do. So tomatoes actually fall into this category. So if you're putting them in a partial sun condition, you are going to get a smaller yield. You are going to get smaller fruits. And they are just sort of going to stretch towards that available sunlight. So they're going to get a little bit leggy. But if you can grow cherry tomatoes or determinate varieties, they are going to be a bit more tolerant of partial sun than the other types. Peppers are the same thing. Peppers absolutely thrive in full sunlight. But if you can get a type of pepper that is a smaller growing pepper, so it doesn't require nearly as much in terms of photosynthesis, they can do okay if they are in some partial sun. They're going to become leggy just like the other, just like the tomatoes do. They're probably going to produce smaller fruits and they're going to have slower growth. But if you can have some patience and just wait on them, if they get about 4 hours a day, they will eventually start to produce some fruits. The smaller the pepper, the more likely it is that they're going to produce for you. Cucumbers, again, they really like to have ample sunlight, but in partial sun conditions, they can produce smaller fruits again, smaller yields or fewer yields. They are going to be a bit leggy, but, in most instances, cucumbers actually like getting some shade during the hottest part of the day because it helps to mitigate some of that stress. So if you are growing in a partial sun condition and you've only got like 3 or 4 hours a day for cucumbers, try to make it the morning sun. So it's getting sort of its happiest level of sun and not getting the afternoon sun that's beating down on it for those 3 or 4 hours. And then finally, beans. So if you're looking at pole varieties, they are definitely going to get leggy and they're going to have a hard time producing. But if you pick bush varieties, it'll help mitigate some of that legginess that would happen in the limited sunlight conditions, especially since bush varieties of beans produce over a shorter season. So they are going to start producing fruit much more quickly, or their beans much more quickly than a pole variety would. And so you're much more likely to get a harvest and get it sooner if you're growing in a partial sun condition. Okay, so did any of these surprise you? Whether it was the answers of struggles from your fellow gardeners or some of the things that you can grow in partial sun? Did it surprise you to know that full sun is only a minimum of 6 hours a day? I challenge you to pay close attention to the actual amount of sun that you receive in your yard or on your patio or on your balcony to see what you might be able to grow. And any one of these partial sun plants would be able to be grown indoors with supplemental light. So leafy greens, herbs, and all of those Asian greens like bok choy perform just fine indoors. Just put them in your sunniest window with a little grow light over their pot. And these are the types of plants that can be harvested multiple times over a longer period of time to get more yield for the small space you have. I swear, you can grow something no matter what kind of space you have. Until next time, my gardening friends, keep on cultivating that dream garden, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Just Grow Something podcast. For more information about today's topic and to find all the ways you can get in touch with me or support the show, go to justgrowsomethingpodcast.com. Until next time, my gardening friends, keep learning and keep growing.